Hi, welcome to our OPD, Ongoing Professional Development Session for 2021. I'm going to start off by apologising for the fact that I didn't manage to get one out in 2020, but as we all know, 2020 was just that kind of year. I started the year very unwell and wasn't able to do anything in January and or in February for that matter, and then we got into the COVID thing and everything just fell apart. But we're here now, and 2021's looking like a whole different animal. At least it is for me producing a video for OPD. The next thing I want to mention, before we get on to our main topic, is the guidelines that the Attorney General's Office puts out for marriage celebrants. It's called Guidelines to the Marriage Act 1961, I think it is. They recently updated that. By recently I mean in 2019, and so if you've been a marriage celebrant for a number of years, it might be worth your while just making sure that you have got an up-to-date copy of that. I'll put the reference for that, the link to that, in the notes on this video, but please grab a hold of that. You can download it in PDF format, and what's really good with that is you don't have to print it out, although you can if you're a bit of a technological troglodyte, but you can just view it on your computer, and in my PDF viewing program it's got a sidebar down the side where you can see where the contents are for each page. But the really good thing about it is you can just do a search Control F and just type in a keyword, and then it'll highlight every instance of that, and you can just flick through, and I think that's a really helpful way to go. The guidelines actually contain almost anything that you're likely to ask as a celebrant, and if you can't find the answer that you want there, please feel free to call me at any time. Although I don't answer the phone after midnight, it's usually turned off. But apart from that, make sure that, feel free to contact me if you've got any questions, especially the curly ones that don't seem obvious in either the training that we've done together or in the guidelines. And if all else fails, the Attorney General's Department actually has a very good email service for celebrants, and you can send in your questions and they'll get back to you. It usually takes about a week or so, but I've contacted them a couple of times and got answers to questions that weren't real clear in the guidelines or before that in the Celebrant's Handbook. Well, today I want to talk about people who were born overseas, and the reason why this has kicked off an interest in me is that about 12 months ago we had a couple join us from the Philippines, and then a few months after that, not long after we were resumed our services after the shutdowns, another couple came along who were actually also from the Philippines, from the same island as this first couple, but they didn't know each other at all, but they were excited to meet each other and find that they came from the same place and they had something in common. What we're finding here is that we get a lot of people, especially from the Philippines, but a few other Asian countries as well, who come here because the local aged care services and a few other services actually act as sponsors for immigrants. And so it's a good way for people from those other countries who want to come here and become permanent residents. So I thought today, the connecting point with this is that this second couple are not actually married yet, but last Sunday they asked me if I can do a wedding for them in October of next year. So that's 18 months away, and not every well-intentioned plan comes to fruition over that timescale. But it got me to thinking about this whole issue of people that are born overseas and the special problems, difficulties or things that you need to be aware of when you are dealing with these issues. So there's a few that I found out just by skimming through the guidelines to the Marriage Act, and a few others that I've thought of along the way. So let's get into it. The most important thing, as far as the government is concerned, relate to the notice of intention to marry. This is sort of like the fundamental scripture as far as the Attorney General's concerned, and it's important that we get it right. We've got to get that form right. And there's a couple of issues that need to be considered when you're dealing with somebody from another country. Probably not so big a big issue, not so much of a big issue when they're from somewhere like the UK or maybe the US or Canada, where we've got a common language, and usually documentation is fairly easy to come by from those countries. But some other countries you may run into difficulties. So let's just talk about that. Firstly, when you're filling in the notice of intention to marry, there is a requirement that you as the celebrant see proof of place and date of birth. And usually, of course, if they're born in Australia, it's a birth certificate, which are easy to get from the various state registries of births, deaths and marriages. Now, with an overseas birth certificate, the people may have one, they may not. If they have one, you may not be able to read it sufficiently clearly to satisfy yourself that they were born in such and such a place on a particular date, especially if it's an Arabic country or Russia, where they use a completely different alphabet. Some European languages you might be able to glean the details, but if it's the case that you cannot satisfy yourself that you can see the date and place of birth of that person on documentation, the best idea is firstly send them to get to have it translated into English by a certified translator. There's a website where people can find the certified translators, and I'll include that in the notes, but it's also there in the guidelines to the Marriage Act. Now, if they don't have a birth certificate available, then the next best step is to ask them. A passport can be a valid proof of place if the details, their date of birth and place of birth are on their passport, whether it's an Australian passport or an overseas passport. That is okay. That's considered adequate proof. If they don't have a birth certificate or a passport, then you can ask them to, or their passport does not list their place and date of birth, then you may direct them to an embassy, the embassy of the country they came from, and again there's a link to a website that lists those. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has those, so I'll have that link in the notes also. Now, there might be a reason why they cannot approach that embassy. Perhaps they're a refugee or a political prisoner or whatever, and going to the embassy of that country is not a practicality. It might be that country doesn't have an embassy here, whatever. In that case, they can write out a statutory declaration on the approved form. You can download that form from the Attorney General's website, and that statutory declaration should state that they were born at such and such a place in whatever country on whatever date you have, and that and list the reasons why they are unable to obtain a birth certificate, and that would be considered acceptable. Under the Marriage Act, if it's not practical to obtain a birth certificate, then a person may provide a statutory declaration instead, but you need to be careful of that. The Attorney General's Office has ruled that there is no reason why anybody born in Australia cannot obtain a birth certificate, and most places, most larger countries should be able to provide a birth certificate. It does take time, and this is really important, and they do not count. The Attorney General's Department does not count as a reasonable excuse inadequate time to get the documentation. So this might be a process that they have to start several months before they actually want to get married. So you need to raise that with them right at the beginning and make sure that if they haven't got that documentation, that they start proceedings to get it as quickly as possible. The second issue on the notice of intended marriage is the proof of identity. You need to be able to certify that this person who claims to be Bill Smith really is Bill Smith. That's a standard thing with all notices of intended marriage, whether the person was born in Australia or some other place. So a passport, either overseas or Australian, is considered acceptable for that purpose also. But there is a proviso on that. An expired passport, that is, it's run out past its due date and hasn't been renewed, is okay. A cancelled passport is not considered acceptable because it has been considered to be fraudulent or incorrect by a border authority, and so you can't use that because it's already been cancelled because it's not a genuine document. So you can use a current passport, an expired passport, but not a cancelled passport, and the identity on that needs to match the identity that the person is going by, and preferably have the same name as on the birth certificate. And other proofs of identity are things like driver's license, photo ID, or whatever, that preferably issued by an Australian authority. A citizenship certificate plus a photo ID of some sort is considered acceptable. So what we're trying to do in this part, the first documentation concerned the name, the place of birth of the person. This one concerns their identity. And basically you have to satisfy yourself that this person sitting in front of you, or the couple sitting in front of you, are the people that they claim to be. And which brings me to another issue. A lot of people coming from from countries where they speak a language that is not English will adopt an anglicised name. For example, a Chinese person called Cheng Ming might call herself Jenny Ming in Australia, just to make it easier so that people aren't worrying about pronunciation, all that sort of stuff. And that raises the question, well, how do I address that anglicised form name? Firstly, in the official documentation, you should use their original name as it appears in their documentation. So on the notice of intended marriage and on the marriage certificate, use the name that is on the birth certificate or the proof of identity. When it comes to the service, there's no such legal requirements, although I think it would be handy when at the beginning you say, we're here today to witness the marriage of so-and-so and so-and-so, that you could say something like, we're here today to witness the marriage of Cheng Ming, also known as Jenny Ming, to so-and-so. So you use the formal given name and also the anglicised form of that name at the beginning, and thereafter during the rest of the service you can just use the name that she or he normally goes by. Okay, the tricky one, if that wasn't tricky enough, is if the person has been divorced. If a person was divorced overseas, they need to provide you with information, documentation, that in which that divorce was granted. Now you might look at it and say, oh, well, it doesn't look genuine. Again, standards for documentation vary from country to country, and what we might think looks a bit dodgy is actually, you know, the normal documentation in that country. And again, if it's given in a language that is not English, you may want to satisfy yourself that that you know, you understand what that document is, and you might ask them to again go and get that document translated. Now it may well be that that document's, you know, entirely valid in the country in which it was issued, but you have to be satisfied that it is a legally issued document. And again, you could recommend that the person contacts the relevant embassy in Canberra, or the High Commission, or the consulate in another capital city, to seek written confirmation that the documentation is legitimate. Yeah, and as I said earlier, the Department of Foreign Affairs website has contact details for all the foreign embassies operating in Australia. If you're still not real certain about it, the best idea is to ask them to go and see a solicitor or the family court and get a written advice that that document is acceptable. It is important, it says in the guidelines, it is important for celebrants to be aware that it is the responsibility of the party to the proposed marriage to satisfy the celebrant that they are free to marry. So they have to prove to you that if you have any concerns that they're still married, then it's up to them. The onus of proof is on them. The fact is that Australia recognises marriages from most countries, and so therefore if somebody comes to you who says they've been divorced but they haven't actually been divorced, then they would be guilty under Australian law of bigamy, and you would be responsible as a celebrant in the commission of such an offence. So again, this whole issue of people born overseas and getting married is an issue that it's a little bit more complicated, but it's not too hard to work out. You just need to be careful that you follow all the reasonable steps to make sure that those people, A, are who they say they are, and B, are entitled to be married under the laws of Australia. One last thing to mention too is that if you have one or both members of the party, the wedding party, are actually don't speak English very well, and you have concerns that they might not understand what's going on, it may be a good idea to suggest that they have an interpreter present in their language at the wedding ceremony, and maybe even at some of the interviews, depending on the availability. That then ensures that they understand, you know that they understand what's going on, and they understand the commitment that they're making and the legal steps or the legal consequences of that commitment. So there you go, that's overseas marriage. A little bit tricky to be sure, but I'm sure that more and more of us will be facing these situations in the years to come. But you know, with common sense and reading your guidelines to the Marriage Act and looking at the relevant sections, you can be sure and confident that you're doing it well and to the glory of God. Well, God bless you. God willing, I'll be able to do another one of these in next year. And as I said earlier on, if you've got any questions, any queries or concerns, feel free to contact me at any time. I'm not an expert, but you know, I can read documents, and I might be able to help you to understand what's required. God bless you.